in a certain way, in a Ze'er Ampen way, in a certain way, this is a bit of a turning point in the Tanya. It's not mamish a new Inyan, but it's a new aspect of the existing Inyan. The Inyan which is occupying us now, is Beinani. And this started in Perek Yud Beis, which for us was a very, very long time ago. And of course, in our learning, we came across two things: Madregas HaBeinani and Midas HaBeinani. The level of Beinani and the measure of Beinani. The level of Beinani is a much higher and deeper and greater thing. And the Midas HaBeinani is something for every person. And it almost seems like every minute of a person's life, they have an opportunity for that minute to be in the matzav of Midas HaBeinani. What's the difference between Madregas HaBeinani and Midas HaBeinani? To be very brief, really. I say it every week for the last 8 months, so this is shir. Yeah, what's the difference between Madregas HaBeinani and Midas HaBeinani? Madregas HaBeinani is defined by a combination of Melucha and Memshala. Melucha means that when a Beinani davens, it's like a tzaddik. And Memshala means the rest of the day is not like a tzaddik. But there's a taste, there's a trace, there's a residue, there's a roshim that's left over from the way he davened to make him continue being a Beinani for the whole day. And on this roshim, on this trace that stays the whole day, you have a number of things that the Alter Rebbe says. And one of them is El Mole HaKadosh Baruch Hu Eizri and Yochle. The fact that the whole day, that little trace of his soiderus that remains from the davening keeps a person a Beinani because the Eibishter helps. That's Madregas HaBeinani. What's Midas HaBeinani? Midas HaBeinani, the Alter Rebbe defines as Davar She'eni Masal Alev. It has nothing to do with feelings. It's simply Machshava Diva Maisa. What I think, what I speak, and what I do. And of course, in discussing this, the Alter Rebbe goes off into a whole discussion about ideas of Lev, Dvarim HaMeshurim L'Lev. And he argues, amongst other things, that even the biggest tzaddikim still have much to grow in as much as Davar HaMasal L'Lev is concerned. And the last thing we learned, the last couple of classes, was that it says in the Gemara, Tehi Tzadik Val Tehi Rasha, that every person, even a Beinani, has to do two avodas. One avodas, don't be a Rasha, which means be a Beinani. And the other avodas means be a tzaddik. And Alter Rebbe explains, be a tzaddik means to try and do what tzaddikim do, to be moyes berah, to be disgusted by evil. And he gives you examples of how a person can be moyes berah on a very practical level and have a love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says, being a tzaddik is not up to us. Being a tzaddik is up to the Meibishter. We have to do the avodah, al teirasha, the being a Beinani, because this is in our hand. And we have to occasionally do the avodah of the Tehi Tzaddik, and if the Eibishter will want. So he says several things. Hergel nasatev hasheni, havaya yases shalei. And then of course the last thing, ula yisabe be'nitzat b'chiras ruach. Shal eizet tzaddik, he'll get another neshama, and he'll be able to be in Madregas Tzaddik. This is what we learned. In short, there's the world of a Beinani. And the world of a Beinani really is defined by thought, speech, and action. By what he thinks and what he says and what he does, right? A tzaddik is a person who's filled with feelings for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And along with his feelings for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's an equal and opposite hatred for what's the opposite of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A Rasha is a person, Rahman al-Itzlan, is involved also in things which are not consistent with the Rasha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Beinani is a person, behaviorally he's like a tzaddik, doesn't do anything that he's not supposed to, but emotionally is like the Rasha. But, however, we did say that even though a Beinani is not like a tzaddik in terms of his regesh, a Beinani is not like a tzaddik in terms of his feelings, a Beinani is like a Rasha in terms of his feelings, a Beinani is like a tzaddik only in terms of his actions. We did say two things. In Perek Yud Beis we said one thing, in Perek Yud Dal we said a different thing. In Perek Yud Beis we said that the way a person is a Beinani and Madregas a tzaddik is that from time to time he does what a tzaddik does. And in Perek Yudalad we said, even though you're not a tzaddik at all, you have a job to try and do kemaisa tzaddikim to be moyes berah. So twice in these 3 parakim, which we've been learning now for a very, very long time. We started this before Purim. Let's speak in the language of known code. Yeah, before Purim, we were holding in these 3 parakim. So the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Yud Beis in one way, and in Perek Yud Daled in a different way, that even though a Beinoni ultimately is tested, is measured by his machshava, diber u'maisa, the Beinoni has to have some feelings. The madrege of Beinoni is on a higher level, Lucha Memshala. Midas HaBeinoni is on a much lower level, and so on. This is what we learned. So with this background, we start to read immediately Perek Tesvav inside Ubazeh. And with the information we have now from the last 3 parakim, in other words, in the last 3 parakim, we've been discussing Beinoni. And now that we spent 3 parakim being Beinoni, I want to explain to you a pasuk and a gemara. Okay, so what's the Ubazeh? The Ubazeh is that even though the real measure of a Beinoni, the definition of a Beinoni basically is, he doesn't do any Avedas in thought, speech, and action, he doesn't miss a mitzvah, ever, in thought, speech, and action. In other words, the Beinoni is defined only by what he does and says and he thinks, not how he feels. But we also said that a Beinoni has to have some kind of feelings, either these kind of feelings, or these kind of feelings. With all of this information, Yuval, we can explain a pasuk and a gemara. The gemara is famous. I guess it's famous because it's brought in Tanya. Yeah, but the gemara is based on a pasuk. The pasuk says, Mashakasos says the pasuk in Malachi. You should turn back and you should examine. You should step back and look. And you'll see, Bein Tzaddik LaRasha, what separates a righteous person from an evil person? Bein Eved Elikim LaSher Le'avade, to a person who serves Elikim, to a person who does not serve Elikim. Now, if you learn Chumash, you learn Mikra, Bepashtus, learn Tanakh Bepashtus, what are you going to say? That Tzaddik is Eved Elikim, and the Rosh is Le'avade, right? Like I always tell you that you look at the Rishonim on Tanakh. I once learned Tanakh. I didn't learn the whole Tanakh, I learned pieces of Tanakh, which is more than most yeshiva bacharim, and of course I didn't learn it in the yeshiva. So one of the things that you have a lot on the Mefarshim on Tanakh, sometimes they'll say it in an abbreviation. Chof Daled Beis Mem Shin. Chof Daled means Kof Al Devarav. The Navi says the same thing twice. Beis Mem Shin is B'milim Shoyni. In Navi is very poetic. It's written in a poetic way. And sometimes it's Kipshute poetry. So you find in some of the Mefarshim a tendency to say that when you have one pasuk or even several psukim that seem to be saying the same thing in a rhythmic way, in a poetic way, they'll say it's not 2 different statements, it's just poetry. And in poems, you write things twice. Repeat the same thing twice. And you have this in Mefarshim, especially the Metzudas, does it all the time. A lot of the Mefarshim bring Metzudas as an achim, but some of the Rishonim also do this, where you'll have a pasuk that says the same thing 2 times, or even more, and they'll say, this is poetry. But you see, this is Teda. It's the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Which means, like it says in the Mishnah, hafachba, v'hafachba, dekulaba. You can dig and you can dig, you can gribble and you can gribble, you can search and you can search and you'll find. Right? The Rebbe brings always, Imrei kumikem. If you take a pasuk of Chumash, even the pasuk achayis leitan timna and timna hisapilegish, and you cannot find a toichen to a pasuk in Chumash, it derekes mikem, it's in you. Because there's no word in the Torah that you don't have on it unbelievable arichas, unbelievable oimek and Torah and Chochmah till Ein Seif, till believable, because Torah is Chochmah Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Torah is one with Ein Sof, and so on. So when the Mefarshim say on a pasuk in Chumash, or a pasuk in Navi, or a pasuk in Ksuvim, Kafel Dvar B'milim Shayna, that these 2 things mean the same thing, it's just being repeated twice, that's true in a certain world. But you go to a higher world, you can ask the question again and again and again, and ultimately there is no aspect of Torah that doesn't have in it an oimek. And if the Torah says the same thing 2 times, it's the pshat that you go to a higher level, they're not going to be the same thing twice, they're going to be 2 very different things. I got regards from somebody from this Maisa. It's an interesting story. I'll tell you just the kitzur, because it's not negate to us. the Racham Strifke Rebbe in Borough Park. His name is Itzikol. He must be a very old man now. That was getting married, and he went into the Rebbe in the early Yuds. And the Rebbe asked him what he was learning, and he told the Rebbe what he was learning, and the Rebbe asked him a kasha what he was learning. So he answered the Rebbe. The Rebbe asked him a question, he answered the Rebbe. And the question the Rebbe asked him was a typical question, and the answer that he gave the Rebbe was written before him. There wasn't a chidish, but it was pashta kasha. Then the Rebbe asked him a question on his answer. When the Rebbe asked him a question on his answer, he had no answer. He was stumped. So he told the Rebbe, "Weiß nicht." So the Rebbe told him, this is one of the examples where you see the inyan of Achtos and Teira, how Teira is Echad. Because the kasha I just asked you doesn't have an answer api nigla, but it only has an answer api Kabbalah and api Chassidus, and the Rebbe told him the answer. When he walked out of the Rebbe, he was all of 16 or 17 years old, but upon him, a verständlicher junger man, he was understanding. When he walked out of the Rebbe, he said, his nephew was Rabbi Twersky from Crown Heights. I heard it from him directly. I heard it secondhand, in other words. He said, when I walked out of the Rebbe's room, I felt like the Rebbe could take any point in Teda you want and ask a kasha and show you that there's no teretz al pi nigla and show you the teretz al pi chassidus, al pi pnimis sanya. So when you say a pasuk and you say head, the Teda is not being so precise. There's a repetition. That's true on a pshat level. Maybe it's true on an emes level, even on a drush. But ultimately, you're going to reach a place where there's no such thing as repetition. Every vav, every koitzesh, a yud, every crown, everything in Teda is precise. So here you have a pasuk. You want to know the difference between a tzaddik and a rasha, and the difference between an eved elikim and asher leyavad, the one who serves Hashem and one who doesn't serve Hashem. Again, in pshutam shel dvarim, you say the same thing. A tzaddik is called eved elikim. A tzaddik serves Hashem. A rasha is called leyavad. A rasha is called someone not serving Hashem for the obvious reasons. But that's only true on a certain level. When you go to a higher level, you cannot say that the Navi is saying the same thing twice. This is Teda, and in Teda everything is exact and precise and necessary. And you have to know the difference between the first statement, which is Ben Tzaddik La Rasha, and the second statement, Ben Eved Elikim La Asher Lo Yavad. So the Rebbe explains, Shahahefresh Ben Eved Elikim La Tzaddik. There's a difference between the word Eved Elikim and the word Tzaddik. Even though on a simple level, Tzaddik is Eved Elikim, and the Rosh is Leyavadei. On a deeper level, Tzaddik and Rosh is one sequence, and Eved Elikim and Leyavadei is a different sequence. And I'll tell you why. Because, and I'm going to put words into the Tanya now, okay? If Tzaddik and Eved Elikim would have been the same, you know what it would say? V'shaftem or Ishem bein Tzaddik la Rasha, bein Eved Hashem, not Eved Hashem. Between Eved Hashem la Shalei Eved. Because it says V'shavta Mishim Bein Tzaddik Bein Oived Elikim, says the Alter Rebbe, that's not the same thing. Why? Let's read. Let the Alter Rebbe talk. Yeah? I'm allowed to let him talk also. I don't have to talk the whole time. Yeah. Sha'ahefresh Ben Oived Elikim. You should know there's a difference between the words the servant of Hakadosh Baruch Hu and the word Tzaddik. How so? Sha'oived is Lashon Hoived. The meaning of the word Oived is a laborer who's in the midst of work. Shu be'emtza avoid in the middle of his work. Which is the war that each of us fights with a Yetzer Hara is Gaber Allah to be stronger than the Yetzer Hara. Well, a Garshem to divorce it, push him out. Ma'ir Ketana from the small city. You may remember that once upon a time we learned Perek Tas, chapter 9, Perek Tes in Tanya, and we learned Perek Tes. The Alter Rebbe discussed the mashal that he used to describe the Melchama, the war to the Nefesh Elokis. The Nefesh Bahamas was a war over a city. That it should not manifest, should not reveal itself, it should not take over the limbs, the organs of the human body. Says the Rebbe, that to be sure, this is in truth Aved of Omal Gadol. It's a work and a great toil. To fight with him, that means to fight with the Yetzer Hara always, which is the Madrega of Beinin. So the word Oived Elikim doesn't mean a servant. It means one who is serving. And there's a very big difference in calling somebody one who is serving and calling someone who a servant. Let's keep reading. Avo, as opposed to Hatzadik, Nikre Eved Avayim. A tzaddik is not called Oived, he's called Eved. A tzaddik is not called Oived Elikim, he's called Eved Avayim. So there's two differences. Right? Which name of the Eibishter is used? By a tzaddik he used the name Avaya, and by the Beinin he used the name Elikim, and by the tzaddik he used the word Evet, and by the Beinin he used the word Ovid. B'Shem HaToyar, with a word and a name that describes this person. Ukmai, just as Shem Chacham, when you call a person wise, or Melech, or you call a person a king, you're not calling him wise because he came up with a good idea. You're not calling him king because he's organizing a specific event. But rather, Shekvar Nasa Chacham Melech. He's in a station, he's in a permanent state of being a Chacham and a Melech. Kach Zeh, the same is true when you talk about a Beinani. You call him Eved Hashem if and when Kvar Oma Ovad Vegomar Legam. He worked and finished the work. The work of the war with the Yetzer Hara. He divorced him and he left. His heart is hollow within him, and this is Madregas Tzaddik. So the difference between Tzaddik and Rasha is very different than the difference between Eved Elikim and Le'avadim. Why? Because Tzaddik is not called Eved Elikim, Tzaddik is called Eved Hashem. Rasha could be either Eved or not Eved. So Alter Rebbe says, by understanding the words precisely, you understand that they can't be the same. Okay? So let's start with this. Okay, start with this. In Chassidus, you have a discussion. It's quite extensive. It's in a lot of Maimorim. It's in a number of Maimorim. But Barichas, Kama Makem, about different kinds of names, different kinds of shemis, different kinds of names. You have something called the Shem HaEtzem. You have something called the Shem HaTeyar. And you have something called the Shem HaPu'ula. Shem HaEtzem is not on our discussion. We're leaving it alone. Huh? I know, but we're not talking here Diktuk, we're talking here Chassidus. Shem HaEtzem, Shem HaToyar, and Shem HaPu'ula. So Shem HaEtzem we're going to leave out of the conversation. We're going to focus only on the second and the third. Shem HaToyar and Shem HaPu'ula. The difference between Shem HaToyar and Shem HaPu'ula is, I'll give you a Yiddish. Ich koch sich in dem, because ich weiß, Gimel Tamas, ich stark gekocht in dem. I spoke about it here also. That in people, in people there's different types of people. And based on different types of people, they live different kinds of lives. And I think, I've said this before, one of the things which I think describes how the Rebbe looks at us, and he's trying to find, what's the word? Simcha, Freilichkeit in our lives is the following. That there's two expressions in Yiddish. Maybe those expressions don't exist, but I'm using them anyway, okay? There's two very different things. One thing is called Zainepis, and the second thing is called Tonepis. Be somebody and do something. What's the difference between being somebody and doing something? If you are somebody, you're that somebody when you're sleeping. You're that somebody when you're on vacation. If you're doing something while you're doing it is good, and when you're not doing it, there's nobody home. So in terms of life, and certainly in terms of Yiddishkeit and Avodas Hashem Lahavil Elef Afi Abdolas, the better existence, the better person, we call a chassid. You call a chassid because he's giving a dal to tzedakah now. You're giving a chassid when you sleep. Right? Why? Because it is epis. A person whose life is so saturated with the principles of Avodas Hashem is a chassid, like the Rambam writes, in his eating and in his drinking and in his dressing and in his walking and in his talking and in his sleeping and in his handlarai. In every aspect of his life, he's a chassid, because chassidus is not what he does, chassidus is who he is. If a person's on a lower level and they're not realistically able to define themselves by who they are, so there's a different solution. And I think this is what the Rebbe tells us. If I can't be a somebody, let me do something. But I can do many somethings. I can be so busy doing some things that I almost never take a break. I go from one thing to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. But it's still a difference in the mahus, in the substance, and the character of this entire person. A higher person is epis. When I cleanse a person, to tepes. A higher person achieves a station which is his permanently, and a lower person doesn't achieve any station, he just does good things. And the same is true here. There are two people, they're both intellectuals. But one is epes and the other tut epes. One is so wise that his very definition is wisdom. When he sleeps, he's wise. When he eats, he's wise. When he vacations, he's wise. Where the Alter Rebbe asks a Poshet Kasha. A Talmud Chacham walks into a room. Or I'll give you a better example. A Talmud Chacham walks into a bowling alley. Or into a pizza shop. What's to the Talmud Chacham in a bowling alley? He has a wife, he has children, he has grandchildren. He's a mashpiyah to Talmidim in a bunk, in a camp, or creates them as a... So if the kids go to the bowling alley, he goes to the bowling alley. A Talmud Chacham walks into a bowling alley, a pizza shop, you have to stand up for him. Say the Alter Rebbe, why? He's bowling. And the Alter Rebbe explains, the Alter Rebbe uses his own signis, because I'm not going to go into the whole of Kabbalah Shabbat, because the Talmud Chacham is not somebody who learns. Talmud Chacham is, he's in a state of Talmud Chacham. And he's epish. Him and Torah are one. Doesn't matter what he's doing. Him and Torah are one. It's possible, chas v'shalom, you should lose the Torah. But if someone does not lose the Torah, no matter what he's doing, he's in a state of being a Chacham. I heard from one of my mashpiyim, the opinion Korfet is the tale. He was in Gan Yisrael. I'm telling the story with the names. Berel Mochkin Stark was the director. I mean, Berel Mochkin is a very unusual chassid. He's in a very special class. There's not a lot of people like Berel Mochkin. He lives in all the worlds. You know, he davens ba'ariches. He's a pneumistic chassid, and at the same time he plays ball with kids in camp. So the opinion noticed that Berel Mochkin was playing with his bunk, and he was throwing the ball with his left hand. You throw the ball with your left hand, it got the end of time. So Pinyan, the Grace of Ashtayer in sports, says to Berel Mochkin, can you imagine the Pinyan's correcting how he's playing ball? He says, Berel, why don't you throw the ball with your right hand? So he says to me, I didn't. He didn't have a chance to daven. Not even have a chance to daven because he slept all day. He didn't have a chance to daven because he was busy. But he had to do something in his life. As This is a person who davening is his business the whole day. So now he's playing ball. He has to play ball, but the davening is in the back of his mind. See, this is the definition of a person who is somebody. Right? That's what the Alter Rebbe says in Likutei Torah. It doesn't matter what a Talmud Chacham is doing. He walks in the room, you get up for him because he's a Talmud Chacham. Then you have another person. He also learns Torah. He also has a good head. But he's not a Talmud Chacham. He learns Torah. But he's not learning Torah to the extent you could say that is Epis. This is him. You can only say Tut Epis. That's a different status. Such a person, while he's learning, you have to get up for him. When he's not learning, whatever the status is, I don't want to start up with the Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe. I'm twisting the Alter Rebbe to serve the purposes of this shiur, so I want to be careful. I don't want to overstate it. But the idea of Adat Pnei Zokin is you say there's a person whose Matthias is Torah, even when he's not learning Torah, his Matthias continues to be Torah. So there's two types, two levels. Being somebody and then doing good things. And that's the difference between the word Eved and the word Oived. Or the difference between the word Chacham and the word Mischakim, or the word Melech or the word Moilech. You have kings. And then you have people who are acting in lieu of kings. Yeah, I remember as a child I read a story, I forgot the story it is. Ein Tag HaMelech, that's the story. Ein Tag HaMelech. Poland was a mess of a situation. And Poland had a bunch of serfs, a bunch of, what do they call them, fiefdoms, city-states with the 101 pritzim. And they had to always have a king. And the king had to oversee all the different pritzim when it came to international affairs like war. Anyway, the king died. So the pritzim had to choose a new king. And intermittently there was no king, so they appointed a Jew. Why did they appoint a Jew? Because they were not afraid that this guy was going to take over the situation. He ruled for one day. It's a story, one of those Yiddish stories. Ein Tag, I read it as a kid. I don't even remember anything. That's all I remember is the title. Ein Tag HaMelech. That's not a melech. It's a moilech, you see. You take a person who's not a king. He doesn't have divine right. It's not Keser Hilmos. But there's a vacancy. There's an emptiness. Someone has to sit in the chairs. You put someone in the chair. That's not a melech, b'shem hatoya. That's not a person who is a king. That's a person who's doing what kings do. And the same is true of Chocham and a Mischakim. Chocham means a person whose definition is wise. He doesn't just do wisdom, he is wisdom. And a Mischakim is a regular person, or maybe an extraordinary person, but you cannot define him by Chochmah. You can simply say that sometimes he's engaged in exploring Chochmah, in creating Chochmah, and so on. This is called in Tanya Shema Toyar and Shema Mushal. A precise use of a word and a borrowed use of a word. Or as I said it a few minutes ago, Shema Toyar and Shema Pu'ula. A name that describes a person and a name that describes an activity. So the Rebbe says that's the difference in the Hebrew word Eved and the Hebrew word Oved. The Hebrew word Eved means someone who's achieved a status where he's a slave. The Hebrew word Oved is a person who has not achieved the status of he's a slave, he's slaving. Yeah. So the Alter Rebbe says, the first part of the pasuk says, "V'shafta manifim mitzadik l'rosh." The second part of the pasuk says, "V'shafta manifim bein eved elakim l'asher le'avadi." Says the Alter Rebbe, they can't mean the same thing. Why? Because if tzaddik is the same thing as oved, it wouldn't say oved, it would say eved. Moreover, if tzaddik was the same thing as oved, it wouldn't say oved, it would say eved, and it wouldn't say eved elakim, it would say eved Hashem. Like Moshe Rabbeinu was called eved Hashem. So the Alter Rebbe says, here's a pasuk that looks like it's the same thing twice. But if you have any seichel at all, you realize it's not the same thing twice. It's two different things. Number one, bein tzaddik l'rasha, and number two, bein eved elakim and asher le'avadi. Tzaddik is somebody who's a somebody. Eved elakim is not somebody. It's a somebody who's doing something. So if that's the case, that tzaddik means one thing and eved elakim means another. So now what's the difference between the Rasha and Asher Le'avadi? In other words, if the first half of the two parts of the respective sukkim, Shaftam and Isam ben tzaddik, and Shaftam and Isam ben eved elakim mean two different things, what about the second half of the pasuk, Rasha and Asher Le'avadi? So here it's similar, but it's a little more aid. The Rasha means Beinani. Rasha doesn't mean a sinner. Rasha means Beinani, someone who could sin, like it says in the earlier paragraph, Perikid Beis. Shemagia lei kemaisar shoy. And what's Le'avadi? It's also a Beinani. But it's a Beinani who's not working. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is doing. We learned in the last three paragraph that we just finished last week, the idea that a Beinani on the one hand is defined by his action and by nothing else. But on the other hand, the Beinani has to have, or does have, or is encouraged to have some kind of feeling. When you understand both of these ideas, that a Beinani is not defined by his feelings, he's defined by his actions, that's side one. But on the other hand, a Beinani has to have some kind of feelings. This pasuk crystallizes, it takes on a form. That tzaddik means somebody who's an eved b'shem atoyer, he has no shaykhis ten averi, he's a tzaddik. And Oved Elakim means a Beinani. A Beinani is not defined by who he is. A Beinani is defined by what he does. And he's an Oved because he's working. What about Rasha? Rasha doesn't mean a bad person. Rasha also means Beinani. And Asher Le'avadi also means Beinani. But Asher Le'avadi means that it's possible for a person to be a Beinani and not have any work. So Rabbi say, I want to tell you a secret. This pasuk is brought in the Gemara in Masechta Kedushin. Okay? The Alter Rebbe just quoted the pasuk, and it seems that the Alter Rebbe has quoted the pasuk innocently. Yeah, it's a pasuk in Malachi, and it's explaining the pasuk. So I just want you to know that in Masechta Kedushin, there's a Gemara that goes on this pasuk that says, "V'shavtam re'isim ben tzaddik l'rasha ben eved elakim la'asher le'avadi." There's a Gemara, and the Gemara says that, he brings the Gemara. I'm looking in the wrong place. He brings the Gemara. That the Gemara says the mashal mishuk shel chamarim. You know this. You remember this from 10 years ago when we learned Tanya the second time. Mashal mishuk shel chamarim. What's the mashal shel chamarim? They had people who made a living. Today you would call them truckers. In those days they were called donkey people. They had a herd of donkeys, 10 donkeys, 20 donkeys, 30 donkeys, whatever they had. And of course the donkeys could be strung together like you string together camels. You could put on each donkey a certain amount of weight, and they know how much each donkey can carry, and they can walk. So if you want to ship material or supplies or food or some other commodity from one place to another in large quantities, you would put them on donkeys. Before the days of the wagon, you put them on donkeys. And depending on how much the load was, that's how many donkeys you needed. And depending on how much distance you wanted to traverse, that's how many days the donkeys needed. So there was presumption, there was chazakis, there was assumed distances. Every day a donkey would go 10 parsa, which is 40 mil. And I think 40 mil is 40 kilometers. That's my humble opinion. If you do the math, in Seichel Anushi it comes out to be 40 kilometers, although a mil is 2,000 amas. 2,000 amas for 3,500 feet. I think it's a kilometer, but okay. This was standard. Why? Because the day is so many and so many hours, and a person walks so many and so many parsa per hour. So if you multiply that times the length of the day, it comes out to be 10 parsa, 40 kilometers a day. What if you're in a rush and you come to the man who owns the donkeys, who's going to do the traveling and the trucking, the delivery? I need you to go faster. So the halacha is that I'll take you 11 parsa a day instead of 10 parsa a day. 10% increase, and the rate is double. He goes instead of 40 mil, 44 mil, instead of 10 parsa, 11 parsa, and he gets paid double. He's going 1/10 more, and the increase in rate is not time and a half, as they say in America. It's 10 times as much. Why? Because it's not normal. The normal journey is ben abeikad from neitza chama to tzei talis tishkias achamanat atzei. That's it. You want him to schlep extra, you pay not a little bit more, you pay much more. And the Gemara brings this mashal for the pasuk, that when it says in the pasuk v'shafta b'isem bein tzadik an eved elikim and asher le'avode. What is the difference between a person who's called an eved elikim? He serves Hashem. And Lasher Leva doesn't serve Hashem. Is like a person who's going 40 miles, 40 kilometers, or 44 kilometers. And he connects it to the Maimon Chazal. What's the Maimon Chazal? That in the times of the Shas, everything I'm telling you now we're going to see later inside, but it's connected to this pasuk. The times of the Shas, the custom was that they would learn everything 100 times. Everything they learned, they chazar 100 times. Now, who in his right mind is going to repeat one thing 100 times? In America, we're afraid to say it twice because chas v'shalom, we may remember it and it'll take space in the computer. And the Torah says because they had no svarim. The Torah was Baal Peh. Everything was to commit it to memory, and commit it to memory in such a way that they would never forget. So they would do it 100 times. So if a person learns a blat Gemara, a halacha, a brayse, a mishnah 100 times, he's called lo yavoda. He's not a servant of Hashem. And he learns 101. All of a sudden, he's called Eved Elikim. Why? Because the definition of Eved Elikim is not that I'm working hard. It means I'm working so hard, I'm going beyond the regilas, I'm going beyond the convention, beyond the presumed, beyond the accepted habit of what's normal. So the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us in this Perek that Tzaddik is called Eved Hashem. It's not called Eved Elikim. And in Beinani, there's two madregas. The higher madrega of Beinani is called Eved Elikim. He's the Beinani who's working. And the lower madrega of Beinani is called Layavada. He's taka Beinani. He's not doing any Avedas. He does every possible mitzvah. And Layavada is not working. Now, of course, remember the flow, the hemshech. What did we have at the end of the Friedrich Perek? What's the ubazeh? What's the continuity? The continuity is two things. Number one, a Beinani is only expected to control his thought, speech, and action, and nothing more. Number two, the Beinani is told to heed tzaddik, that occasionally you have to try doing the Aved of tzaddik. In other words, occasionally it's not just enough to do what the Eibishter wants, it's to try and love Hashem and be disgusted by evil. So after you have these two ideas, the Alter Rebbe says, now you understand what's meant Eved and Le'avad. You're talking about two types of Beinani. Beinani, no Avedas. And one is called Eved, one is a serious, in the service of Hashem. And the second is called Le'avad. He's taka Beinani, he's very fluid, but he's not in the service of Hashem, because he's not going out of his guilt, he's not going out of his hand. Okay, so let's read it one more time. I'm sorry for the repetition. It says the Alter Rebbe, Ubazeh Yuvan, and with the information that we have from before about the idea that Beinani has to at least attempt to experience Avodas HaTzadikim, which is a feeling for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Mashakasa, but it says in the Pasuk, V'shafta, and turn back. With Isam and examine. Bein Tzadik la Rasha, what separates a righteous man from an evil man. Le'eved Elikim, Bein Eved Elikim Lasher Le'avada, you who's worshipping Hashem, one who's not. Says the Rebbe, Tzadik and Rasha means Bepasha, Tzadik and Rasha. Tzadik means V'libi Cholol B'kirbi, he has no Yetzer Hara, he killed it with fast. And a Rasha could be a Beinani also, because Magia like a Maisa Rasha. And the second part is talking about Beinani. So he says, Shahevresh Bein Eved Elikim Latzadik. There's a big difference between calling somebody one who is in the service of Hashem and one who's righteous. Sha'oivedu, the meaning of one who is in the service of, is Lashon Heve. This is proactive. Shuba Emtza, he's in the middle of the work. Shahu HaMelcham Im HaYetzer Hara, which is the war with the Yetzer Hara. Lizgabed, allowed to be stronger than the Yetzer Hara. Ulagash, to divorce it. Ma'ir Katana, from the small city. Shalei Yislabish, maybe that Gufa should never have manifestations, never have control over the small city, which is the body of the person. And the Alter Rebbe makes a very unusual concession. I know no other place in Tanya the Alter Rebbe admits. Shehu Aveda, Shu Be'emes, Aveda, Be'omel Gadol. You want the truth, says the Alter Rebbe. And I'm going to put words into the Alter Rebbe's mouth. I do that for a living. Alter Rebbe says, I'm Taka Tzaddik. But not everybody is Tzaddik. And I know, even though I'm not a Beinoni myself, that to be a Tzaddik is Aveda, Be'omel Gadol. It's very hard work. Huh? Lehilachem, boy, to fight with the Yetzer Hara Tamid all the time. And the Alter Rebbe says, Hainu Bein Shel Bein. Aval, as opposed to what tzaddik, the meaning of the word tzaddik is Eved Ad Hashem B'Shem Atei, he's a servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a name, which is not describing what he's doing, is describing who he is. Describing what he's doing is called a behavior, a function. Describing who he is defines the person, no matter what he's doing, he's in a state called Chochmah, or Malchus, or so forth. Okay, for example, Shem Chacham and Melech, when you call somebody a king or wise, says the Rebbe, Shekvad Nefesh Chacham and Melech, he's already in a station of being wise or being a king. In other words, it's not something he's doing; it's something that he inexorably is. Kach, the same is true here. Said this person, if he's in Madregas Tzaddik, Kvar Ovad Legamar, he worked and completed the work. His work with his milchama, with his own ra, it divorced it and it left him. But that's only a tzaddik. A tzaddik is called Eved Hashem B'Shem Atei. What about a Beinoni? A Beinoni is not Eved Hashem, Beinoni is Eved Hashem. And then the Rebbe continues. The Beinoni also has two levels. The higher level is called Eved Elokim, that his serving of Hashem involves a war. He's called the servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the second is called V'asher Le'avoda. He's taka Beinoni. He has no Avedis, but he's not struggling. V'afa B'kein and Yerosha. He's not a Rosha because he has no desire to Avedis. And we'll see him in Hashem next week.